Microphone working? All right, it appears to be. Great. Okay. Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1. The opening scene of the greatest thing by the greatest writer. Where to start? Okay, well, as with anything by Shakespeare, we've got three levels of stuff to be paying attention to here. The most basic level would just be what's going on, the series of events. Because we've got, as in any plot-based thing, novel, movie, whatever, we've got characters interacting with each other, doing things, performing a series of actions that will affect the actions that get performed in the next scene, and so on and so on. In other words, the aspect of it that would be the same even if it weren't written in Shakespearean language. And then, of course, we've got the other two levels that are specific to the fact that it is written in Shakespearean language. You've got, for Shakespearean beginners, the problem of following the meaning of what everybody is saying, quote unquote, translating, even though it's not technically translating because Shakespeare is not speaking a different language. It isn't Old English. It isn't Middle English. People who use those terms for Shakespearean English are mistaken. He's speaking, well, if you want to be highly technical about it, early modern English, but the same English that we speak today, with the exception of, some these and thous and more case endings at the end of verbs. You've got the concerns with adjusting that, getting the basics of the gist of what everybody is saying, so that you can understand, okay, basically what this guy's point is here, or basically what that guy's point is there, is this. And then you've got the third, the highest, and really the most important, in my opinion, level, the level that makes Shakespeare Shakespeare, which is the way that they put everything, right? This is what you lose if you were reading, No Fear Shakespeare, or one of those editions where it's got Shakespearean English on one page and the speech is dumbed down into contemporary English on the facing pages. I have nothing against using one of those, especially if you're a Shakespearean beginner and it helps you to look back and forth to make sure that what you think somebody is saying is really basically what they're saying. But just like training wheels on a bike, remember the goal is eventually to not need that stuff. The issue is not just translation, right? When something like that is happening, the issue is depoeticization, right? When you translate something from poetry into non-poetry, right? Whether it's poetry from 1599 or poetry written last week. When you translate something from poetry into non-poetry, you're missing all of the little artistic inflections, the stuff beyond, above, external to the gist of what it means, that make it the stuff that raises questions, that introduces what, to use an English class word here, themes. The way that people put things is important, not just the gist of what they say. So as we go through the play scene by scene, we're going to be making sure everybody is up to speed on all three of those things: the basics of the series of events, what did these characters just do in terms of interacting with each other, how's that going to affect things going forward, what is the most important stuff to notice in terms of the basics of what they all said to each other, in terms of remembering information that is going to become important later. And then finally, and most importantly, how does the way that they put everything relate to the grander philosophical questions raised by the scene, or if we want to keep using the English class word, the themes raised by the scene. Now, even though 1.1 is, well, it's the very beginning. We haven't met any of the major characters yet. We have not met the titular Prince Hamlet yet. We'll meet him in the next scene. Well, I guess the ghost is arguably a major character, though he hasn't said anything yet. Horatio, of course, Hamlet's BFF from college, his I guess roommate from Wittenberg, shows up in this scene. But in terms of a series of events, we don't have anything too complex here. We've got some guys see a ghost, go, holy crap, it's a ghost, try and get the ghost to say something. It won't say anything. And at the end of the scene, they decide, okay, well, maybe the ghost of our dead king, Hamlet Sr., who died shortly before the play began. Maybe he has something private to say to his son, the Prince Hamlet, Hamlet Jr., and the scene ends with them resolving to go find the prince and tell him they've seen his dad's ghost, or at this early point in the play, I suppose, what appeared to be his dad's ghost. Nobody is sure yet. That's important. Now, before we get into anything more specific than that, if I had to pick one scene, or one line that I guess is emblematic of the themes of this scene, the stuff that's supposed to be on our mind, it's well, the line I was pointing to in the thumbnail, what Horatio says at line 112. A mote it is to trouble the mind's eye. Now, a mote related to like matter. In other words, it's like having something stuck inside the eye of your mind. You know, when you get a little piece of crap in your eye there and it's annoying, this thing that they did not expect to see, this ghost, is like having a little piece of crap caught in your eye, but inside the eye of your mind. Now, the way this is put, modern audiences might not recognize, but Shakespeare's original audience would have recognized that there's not one but two religious references in this line. Right, the mote in the eye is a reference to a phrase from Scripture about hypocrisy. Right, you know, worry about the beam in your own eye before talking about the mote in your neighbor's eye. In other words, pay attention to the giant freaking thing that's wrong with you before you complain about the minor thing that's wrong with the other guy. And even the phrase "the mind's eye" itself, it's used more than once in this play, and a lot of modern readers assume, as would be the case with so many things we see in a Shakespeare play that have since become expressions, we assume that Shakespeare himself invented that phrase. Now, we are going to see a lot of expressions, a lot of phrases, a lot of turns of phrase in this play that have since become common expressions, and 90-something% of the time, it is the case that Shakespeare himself invented those phrases. But with the phrase "the mind's eye," Shakespeare himself did not invent it. It's a much older expression. It's actually from the work of St. Augustine, the early Christian theorist and saint and writer, who probably used it in Latin, you know, oculus mensa or something. But many people in Shakespeare's audience would have regarded this term, "the mind's eye," not just as a cool way of referring to the imagination or to one's own storehouse of beliefs, but to something specifically religious, right? This ghost, this dead king, that's running around is not just a spooky problem. It is specifically a religious problem. It is something that is not supposed to happen. Okay, so with this line, "a mote it is to trouble the mind's eye," this raises the larger question of how is it that we react, right? And notice I'm not saying the characters, I'm saying we, all of us, right? Because there are always implications in Shakespeare for not just what these characters are saying and doing, but what does that have to do with all of us or with the human race in general? So the question that's raised by this scene is, how do we react when we encounter something that doesn't fit with what we thought we knew? That confounds or that contradicts the way we saw the world before, right? In this case, a ghost. Now, the fact that this does have, flipping back to the, now that I've done a big picture idea here, flipping back to the beginning of the scene to go bit by bit, the fact that this has and Shakespeare was always like that, but I think in Hamlet, even more so than Shakespeare is most of the time, there's a very heavy implication that, this is about all of you out there in the audience. Look at the first line, right? Who's there? So the curtain rises. We have a dude, Bernardo, on a guard duty outside a big spooky castle in Denmark in the Middle Ages, in the middle of the night, pacing back and forth in front of the door with the big, a pike staff or whatever on his shoulder, and then hearing a noise, suddenly turns and who's there? Aiming it out at the darkness, which of course is where the seats, where the audience would be. So the play opens with a dude asking you, at pike point, no less, who you are. And that question is going to keep getting asked of all of us in a rather relentless way over the course of the next 5 acts. Now, this is also a very early and very subtle bit of foreshadowing of something that, largely courtesy of Prince Hamlet himself, the play is just going to keep doing, right? Which is messing with the idea that it's a play. Reminding us that what we're seeing is, is theater, is fake, but is, real at the same time. So this is a very early taste of a moment with this who's there, as though we're being asked out in the audience. A moment where the play messes with this idea of knowing that it is a play and that there is an audience out there that's watching it. Bernardo and Francisco are on guard duty. Horatio and Marcellus come in. Francisco leaves, so we've got Horatio, Marcellus, and Bernardo on stage. Now, Marcellus and Bernardo are guards, palace guards, armed, uniformed. Horatio, as will soon become clear, is not a military guy. He's an intellectual, a college boy. Hamlet's friend from Wittenberg. More on Wittenberg in the next scene and why it's important that Hamlet and Horatio go to college there. But that was known in the Renaissance to be an excellent school, so it marks Horatio as a smart guy. Now, in keeping with his status as an educated man, he doesn't believe in ghosts, right? As everybody is sitting down around lines 20 through 35, the guards are trying to convince Horatio, like, no, we're not messing with you. The dead king's ghost has been walking around. We've been seeing it every night. And at line 29, Horatio's all, tush, tush, 'twill not appear. You guards are drunk out here imagining things or whatever. I've been to college. I know there's no such thing as ghosts. And then, not even 10 lines later, what do you know? Holy crap, it's a ghost. What they told me in college was wrong, right? Horatio is the educated guy in this scene. So we've got 2 different kinds of people on stage, right? The educated guy, Horatio, and the soldier, right? The nerd and the tough guys. Both of them are trying to confront this thing that should not be in their own ways, and none of it is working. At line 42, Marcellus is like, "Thou art a scholar, speak to it, Horatio." And Horatio's like, "Well, me? What do you? I didn't even believe in ghosts 10 seconds ago." That's an almost comic, or it would be funny if the scene were not so tense with this ghost swooping around. An almost comic irony, right? The guards, the tough guys, the military men are trying to convince the nerd, the scholar, the intellectual that there's really such a thing as ghosts. He doesn't believe them. And then as soon as the ghost enters, they all look at him like he's supposed to do something. Note on the ghost. This is, and it happens not even 2 pages into the play. This is Shakespeare marking this play as special, as different. We're used to ghosts and supernatural things in Shakespeare. There are any number of Shakespeare plays where ghosts appear. Caesar's ghost appearing to his murderers at the end of Caesar, Banquo's ghost appearing to Macbeth and Macbeth. Other Shakespeare plays that you read in school also feature ghosts. But This is different. This is the only scene in all of Shakespeare, though there are many ghosts in Shakespeare. This is the only scene in all of Shakespeare where multiple people all see a ghost at once. And it happens barely one page into the play. Now, why is that significant? Well, because in all of the other Shakespeare plays where we see a ghost, it is a matter of interpretation whether the ghost is real, right? And it is at least heavily implied most of the time that it's not, right? Is that really Banquo's ghost at the banquet and no one else can see him, or is Macbeth imagining Banquo's ghost out of his tortured conscience? Same thing for Caesar's ghost and anybody else's ghost who appears often, to their killer. So Shakespeare is beginning this play by going, okay, I know you're used to me with the always with the imaginary ghosts, and it's probably just the guy's guilty conscience. Not this time. This ghost is real. A bunch of people are seeing him at once and turning to each other and agreeing about what they saw. Right? That's most of the conversation we see in this scene. So it's letting the audience know, the ghost ain't anybody's imagination this time. Despite the fact that he didn't believe in ghosts 5 seconds ago, Horatio tries his best. What art thou that usurps this time of night together with that fair and warlike form in which the majesty of buried Denmark did sometimes march? Note how he puts that. The majesty of buried Denmark, right? Not the buried majesty of Denmark, which still would have scanned and been the meter that Shakespeare needed. This is one of the many, many lines in the play that accentuates the importance of kingship, right? One king's reign ending and a new king's reign beginning was essentially a new world, right? It's not just that the king has been buried, is dead and buried, but the version of Denmark over which that king presided is, in a manner of speaking, buried as well. Right, an entire idea of the past or of the whole nation died with the king. So at line 48, it's not the buried majesty of Denmark, it's the majesty of buried Denmark. Speaking of the way people put things, near the top of that page, lines 30 through 34, Bernardo says to Horatio, sit down a while and let us once again assail your ears that are so fortified against our story, what we have tonight seen. Now, if you've got one of those No Fear Shakespeare or whatever editions where they simplify, let's say, which is not to say dumb down or ruin the language, they probably translate that into something like, sit down and let us talk to you again about this thing that you don't want to believe. Now, that is basically what Bernardo means, but the way he puts it is just as important. Sit down a while and let us once again assail your ears that are so fortified against our story. Well, in keeping with his status as a military man, as a soldier, he's using a military metaphor. Let us once again assail, meaning attack, your ears that are so fortified against our story, like you have walls up against it. And the fact that he puts it that way makes us realize a general rule about argumentation and conversation, right? Hey, yeah, trying to convince somebody of something that they don't want to believe, that they've decided they don't want to believe because it doesn't fit in with how they see the world, is kind of like, attacking a fortified position in a war. Right, that person has built up, in a manner of speaking, walls against hearing what you're hearing, and you're trying to blow them up with dynamite or knock them down with a battering ram or whatever you're trying to do. So argumentation, and this is about intellectual stuff, nerd stuff, right? Beliefs. What is or is not true, and what's your evidence for it? Even not 2 pages into the play, we have this this minor thing that a minor character says for 2 seconds that unifies the all of the intellectual stuff going on in the play. What does this or that really mean? The grand philosophy of this work, and all of the violence and fighting aspects of it, because you've got famously, right, there's one of the things that makes Hamlet, both of those things going on, and often failing to cohere. So even just in the first couple of pages, we've already got the ways that certain characters are putting things, hinting at these two sides to our story here as we go. Okay. The ghost is, swooping on stage, swooping off stage, almost messing with them. The ghost leaves again at around line 51. Horatio, still amazed that, oh my God, I guess there was such a thing as ghosts after all. Marcellus asks at line 58, is it not like the king? Horatio responds, as thou art to thyself. In other words, it looked as much like the dead king, Hamlet Sr., as you look like yourself. It's as like the king as thou art to thyself. This is a thing you might blow right by on a first reading, but once you're more familiar with the play, you'll notice this as a very clever bit of thematic foreshadowing on Shakespeare's part, because it begs the question, well, how much are you really like yourself anyway? We take it for granted that, thou art like thyself, that you are you from one moment to the next. But the extent to which we can rely on that, the extent to which that is really true, and it's an idea that's very common in philosophy nowadays. But here is Shakespeare raising it in a very slick, blink and you'll miss it way back at the buzzer of the 16th century. Okay, the long exchange between Marcellus and Horatio running from lines 70 to 107 about the beef with Norway, I'm going to come back to, so put one of your fingers in there. Okay, now what we see in the "Mote it is to trouble the mind's eye" speech at around line 112 is Horatio, doing what he's been trained to do, right? Trying to make rational, logical, scholastic, right, academic sense of this. In the most high and palmy state of Rome, a little ere the mightiest Julius fell, the grave stood tenantless, and the sheeted dead did squeak and gibber in the Roman streets. In other words, he's referencing the legend that before Julius Caesar, the subject of an earlier play by Shakespeare, was assassinated. There were rumors that the zombies walked the streets, and that there was all these signs and portents, eclipses and whatever in the sky. The like precursive feared events as harbingers preceding still the fates and prologue to the omen coming on. So he's trying to look at this and go, he's trying to make it logical, right? That's what school has taught him to do. But he's dealing with something fundamentally illogical, right? A ghost. I mean, if ghosts are flying around, I mean, what is more central to the idea of being an educated person that there's no such thing as ghosts? Supernatural stuff is BS. That's like plank one of, certainly from a modern perspective, and even this being the Renaissance and all, that idea was beginning to take hold even in Shakespeare's time. Remember that although this play is set in the Middle Ages, it was written it's around 1599. First performed around 1599, 1600, 1601. Although many people, including me, believe that Shakespeare was working on it for many years in private before then. We're putting more work into it than he did into any of his other plays, getting every last little thing perfect. So it's coming out in the around the year 1600, so a little over 400 years ago. It's set in the Middle Ages, but in terms of how long in the past it was set, even relative to Shakespeare's audience, this is set as long ago to Shakespeare and his contemporaries as Shakespeare was from us, right? Shakespeare was 400 years ago from us, and the play is set in the Middle Ages about 400 years ago from Shakespeare. Now, there are certain anachronistic references. People refer to things that actually hadn't been invented yet in the Middle Ages, if we're being strictly historical. As far as how we know exactly when the play takes place, there are some things later in the play that the king says that allow us to date it fairly precisely. Oh, and I personally think Shakespeare is playing this elaborate game where we're supposed to understand that Hamlet takes place simultaneously with Macbeth. Anyway, more on that later. So Horatio, as a Renaissance intellectual, a scholar, is trying to make a logical sense of this fundamentally illogical thing, this ghost. As Shakespeare's world was. Right back in the Middle Ages, when the play is set, everybody, as far as we know, believed in ghosts. So what these characters and what Shakespeare's audience would have felt, even in this early scene, is a sense of being sucked back into the past. Right, the play opens with this educated guy realizing that his whole fancy education that he went all the way to Germany for. Didn't know what it was talking about. They told him there was no such thing as ghosts on the very first day, and here's a ghost. He's still trying to, fall back on knowledge as a way of dealing with this, as the ghost, with its arms spookily spread, floats towards him around lines 128 through 140. If there be any good thing to be done that may to thee do ease and grace to me, speak to me. In other words, are you back here as a ghost because there's something we have to, we've got to put your old teddy bear from when you were a kid on your grave or something so you can rest? Is that it? Ghost doesn't say anything. If thou art privy to thy country's fate, which happily foreknowing may avoid, oh, speak. In other words, are you here to warn us about something bad that's going to happen to Denmark? Ghost doesn't say anything. Or if thou hast aborted in thy life extorted treasure in the womb of earth, for which they say your spirits oft walk in death, speak of it, stay and speak. Like, did you bury treasure when you were alive and you want to come tell us where it is? No, not that. Yeah, I didn't think so. Okay, I'm out of ideas. That's everything I've ever heard about ghosts. And as soon as the smart guy runs out of, falling back on, okay, they didn't tell me anything about what to say to ghosts in school, but my grandma used to say sometimes they buried treasure. Or he's clinging to any scrap of knowledge from an officially smart source or not. He runs out of stuff to say, and then at line 40, Marcellus's line, "Shall I strike at it with my partisan?" The others say, "Do if it will not stand." Marcellus throws his spear, and the ghost vanishes. That's another line in 1.1 that almost, if it were not such a creepy and highly dramatic context, would be funny. The smart guy is trying to fall back on knowledge. When he runs out of all the stuff he's ever heard about ghosts, the soldier's like, should I throw my spear at it? And everyone's like, yeah, okay. We're out of other stuff to do. Throw your spear at it. See if that does anything. But of course it doesn't. So the smart guy has tried his words. The tough guys have tried their weapons. None of it worked. None of it affected the ghost. None of it even got the ghost to talk. And look at in the closing 30 lines or so, how qualified everyone's pronouncements are. Horatio's like, "I have heard the cock that is the trumpet to the morn doth with his lofty and shrill sounding throat awake the god of day." In other words, why did the ghost vanish when the dawn came up, and Horatio saying, "I've heard that the rooster wakes up the god of day, and then the rule is all the ghosts have to go home." Then Marcellus says, "Some say that ever against that season comes wherein our Savior's birth is celebrated, i.e. Christmas, this bird of dawning singeth all night long, and then they say no spirit dare stir abroad," etc. In other words, some people say that at Christmas time the rooster sings all night long, and that's why ghosts can't come out and witches are powerless at Christmas. So everybody was so sure about what they were saying. Horatio was all "tush, tush, twill not appear" at the beginning of the scene. And then in the closing lines of the scene, everyone's like, "I have heard this, and some people say that." They're all falling back on rumor and conjecture. If it's possible for ghosts to be real, then I guess I don't know what to believe anymore. I've heard this, some people say that. All belief is up for grabs. And look at how Horatio in line 165 responds to what Marcellus says about roosters at Christmas. "So have I heard, and do in part believe it." This relates to that "as thou art to thyself" bit from a few pages ago, right? You can half believe something. Do you believe this? It's not always yes or no. It's sort of. For religious people, you may experience some they tell you one thing about where existence and people and the planets and whatever came from in school. They tell you another thing about where all that stuff came from in church. Which one do you believe? Well, I believe the church thing when I'm in church, and the school thing when I'm in school, and try not to think about them both at the same time. There's a story about some famous scientist, I forget who, being asked in an interview, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And he said, "No, but ask me again at night." We like to think of our beliefs, and as a result, our identities, or who we are, being the same from moment to moment. But they're really not, if we're being honest with ourselves. In the daytime, the idea of ghosts is laughable. When we're alone watching a scary movie at night, it's not as laughable as it was in the daytime. The idea that we are, in terms of what we agree or disagree with in here, the same person from moment to moment, is it's true in the sense that our fingerprints and our social security numbers don't change. But aside from that, anyway, so they decide, okay, maybe what the ghost had to say was a secret. We'll go tell Hamlet Jr., the prince, the dead king's son, about it. Or, as the play puts it, "Do you consent we shall acquaint him with it, as needful in our loves, fitting our duty?" A thing to catch there is there are two reasons, Horatio says, that they should go tell Hamlet what they've seen, right? It is both needful in our loves and fitting our duty. Right, loves and duty. In other words, Prince Hamlet is our friend. We like him and we care about him. So, right, it's needful in our loves. We have it in terms of our personal identities. We should want to go tell him because he's our friend. But at the same time, he's the prince, and as guards and everybody else, he's our boss. So it's also our job to tell him in a political sense. So you've got this in the very closing lines of the very first scene, this division between loves and duty. What your heart wants you to do and what your social responsibilities, your job, or what society or other people expect of you, what you're supposed to do according to this standard. Sometimes those things match, right? It is both needful in our loves and fitting our duty that we go acquaint the prince with what we've seen. But sometimes those things don't match. Sometimes your loves and your duty are in conflict. And we're going to see many instances as the play progresses where various characters' loves and duty are in conflict. So another bit of thematic foreshadowing there. Now, I did say I was going to flip back to that long exchange between Marcellus and Horatio, going from line 70 to around line 108. That's going to become important later. What's being discussed here is the ongoing minor plot, something that we continually forget about and then get reminded of and forget about again and get reminded of again and forget about again, etc. The ongoing beef between Denmark and Norway. Now, starting at line 70, Marcellus asks, good, now sit down and tell me, he that knows, why the same strict and most observant watch so nightly toils the subject of the land. In other words, how come we've got more guards on duty than we normally do? Why such daily cast of brazen cannon and foreign mart for implements of war? How come we've got the forges going every day, making weapons, making cannons? Why such impress of shipwrights whose sore task does not divide the Sunday from the week? How come we've got people building more boats, working even on Sunday, right? Their sore task does not divide the Sunday from the week. Even in Shakespeare's time, in the Renaissance, and certainly in the Middle Ages when the play is set, that was a big deal, not working on the Sabbath. You were supposed to honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. So if you've got guys working to build weapons of war on Sunday, they're breaking one of the 10 Commandments. That wasn't done lightly. You didn't just do that because you felt like having some extra ships. You did that if it was a matter of life and death. Marcellus has noticed all that and gone, hey, what's going on? Are we going to get attacked? Horatio responds to Marcellus's, who is that can inform me, with, that can I, at least the whisper goes so. In other words, well, I haven't been told officially, but here's the rumor. And he then gives us the backstory of the duel many years ago between King Hamlet, Hamlet Sr., the ghost they just saw, and King Fortinbras of Norway. Our last king was, as you know, by Fortinbras of Norway, thereto pricked on by a most emulate pride, dared to the combat, in which our valiant Hamlet, for so the side of our known world deemed him, did slay this Fortinbras, who by a steel compact, well ratified by law and heraldry, did forfeit with his life all those his lands which he stood seized of to the conqueror. In other words, he's referencing this medieval idea that, and who knows how often it really happened, but the Middle Ages were as much a matter of legend to Shakespeare and his audience in some ways as they are to us. The idea of, instead of two countries going to war, the two kings would put on their suits of armor, take up their broadswords, and fight one-on-one. It says here that happened. There was a one-on-one duel between King Hamlet of Denmark and King Fortinbras of Norway, and Hamlet killed Fortinbras. As a result of this, Denmark got a bunch of Norway's land. Now, sir, young Fortinbras, Horatio says at line 95, hath in the skirts of Norway here and there sharked up a list of lawless resolutes for food and diet, to some enterprise that hath a stomach in it, which is no other but to recover of us those foresaid lands so by his father lost. This I take it as the main motive of our preparations. In other words, the rumor is Fortinbras Jr., who's also got the same name as his dead father, is raising a mercenary army, right? A list of lawless resolutes, not the official Norwegian army, but is raising a guerrilla, a mercenary army to come get revenge, come attack Denmark and get back the land that his father lost all those years ago. So that's probably what we're preparing for. Now, what we notice here is a obviously deliberate parallelism. Mirror images, right? Here in Denmark and over there across the water in Norway. In both places, you've got a dead king and a living prince with the same name as his father. Here in Denmark, we've got Hamlet Sr., the dead king whose ghost is flying around, and Hamlet Jr., the prince who's alive, who we'll meet in the next scene. Over there in Norway, we've got Fortinbras Sr., who's dead, killed all those years ago by Hamlet Sr., and his son, Fortinbras Jr., who's grown up and wants revenge on Denmark. Now, this is well, confusing, obviously, all of the same names. You don't give different characters the same name in a play unless there's a very good reason. So obviously Shakespeare is doing this to really nudge us in the ribs about some ongoing theme of identity or responsibility being inherited, right? Having these two sons with the same names as their dead fathers that we get told about in the very first scene. Both of them are going to end up wanting revenge, but so far we've only heard about Fortinbras Jr. and why he wants revenge. The idea that who you are is, in many ways, not up to you, is the result of a bunch of stuff that happened when you were young or before you were born. Other people, right, like your parents who name you, or who might name you after them, like you're supposed to carry on what they did. They have an idea of what you're supposed to do. Society, right? What's fitting your duty has another idea of what you're supposed to do. And you've got to try and please all of these other concerns while being yourself at the same time. I might add, this is something Shakespeare changed about the original Hamlet legend. For those who don't know, William Shakespeare did not invent the character or the story of Prince Hamlet of Denmark. It was an old even in Shakespeare's time, centuries old Scandinavian legend about a prince who sees his dad's ghost and has to, spoilers, avenge his dad's death. But Shakespeare changed a lot of stuff about that original legend. All of this stuff with Fortinbras Jr. and Sr. and a beef with Norway is stuff Shakespeare is inventing and adding to the story, as is the plot point that father and son, king and prince, have the same name, that they are Hamlet Sr. and Hamlet Jr. In the original legend, the father's, the dead king, the ghost's name was Horvendel, and his son was Amleth, which later got anglicized a bit more to Hamlet. It was Shakespeare's innovation to give father and son the same name, make them Hamlet Sr. and Hamlet Jr., I guess, to push a little more to the forefront some ongoing theme of your life, or one's life, fairly or unfairly, being to an extent carved out for you. So we've heard about young Fortinbras, who's all grown up, doing what he thinks the world expects of him. And in the next scene, 1.2, we'll meet our main character, Prince Hamlet, and find out what he thinks the world expects of him. See you then.